Right now, somewhere in northern Tanzania, a Hadza woman is walking back to camp with a digging stick and a sack of berries. She's 23, has 2 children, and has been married twice. Her first husband left after a year. No fight, no court, just packed his arrows and walked to another camp. Her second husband is a good hunter. She chose him because he shares his meat fairly, can make her laugh, and doesn't pick fights with the other men. They started sleeping at the same hearth one night about 4 years ago, and that was it. They were married. No ceremony, no ring, no paperwork, and everyone in camp understood the arrangement perfectly. For 300,000 years, every human who ever lived found a partner this way. Not through a screen, not through a cold approach at a bar, but inside a small, tight face-to-face world where everyone knew everyone else's full history. And yet, if you ask most people today how ancient humans chose each other, they'll give you some version of the same image. A caveman with a club, knocking a woman unconscious, dragging her by the hair. That image is a lie. It was invented in 1865 by a Scottish lawyer who never met a hunter-gatherer in his life. The reality is far more interesting, and it tells us exactly why modern dating feels so broken. For 99% of human history, you did not date. You were born into a band of roughly 25 to 50 people. By adulthood, you knew every eligible person within a day's walk. You had known them since childhood. You knew who was lazy, who was generous, who lied, who was loyal, who could keep up on a long foraging trip. Attraction wasn't based on a 5-second glance at a curated photo. It was built slowly, from thousands of small observations accumulated over years. And it was almost never solely your decision. Anthropologists, who have studied the historical records of 190 hunter-gatherer societies, found something that might sound suffocating to modern ears. In 85% of those cultures, marriages were arranged, not by some distant king, but by parents and close kin who knew both families intimately. In most of these cultures, if you were the groom, you did not just take a wife. You went and lived with her family for months or years. You worked for them. You proved you could hunt, share, and not cause problems. It was called bride service. Not a transaction, a trial period. And in nearly 90% of these societies, fewer than 1 in 5 men had more than one wife, which sounds controlling to modern ears. Until you realize your ancestors were not marrying strangers. They were marrying people whose entire personality was already public knowledge. Everyone knew everything. There was no getting to know you phase. There was no wondering if someone was hiding something. There was no lying on a first date, because lying was pointless. Everyone already knew. And if the marriage didn't work, she left. Among the Hadza, female choice drives everything. A woman can walk away at any time, and she often does. Nearly half of first marriages end within a few years. There is no shame, no legal battle. She owns almost nothing, and neither does he. She simply walks to another camp, to another family, to another life. By her mid-20s, she has usually found someone stable, someone she chose. So what were they looking for? The answer is both familiar and surprising. In 1989, the evolutionary psychologist David Buss published a landmark study of mate preferences across 37 cultures, from urban Brazil to rural Zambia. He found that everywhere, in every culture, both men and women rank kindness as the single most important trait in a long-term partner. After that, the sexes diverged. Women placed more value on a man's ability to provide resources. Not wealth, which didn't exist, but things like foraging skill, work ethic, status in the group. Men placed more value on cues of fertility, youth, health, physical signs of reproductive capacity. But in the actual lives of hunter-gatherers, these preferences played out differently than you might expect. When Frank Marlowe asked Hadza men what they wanted in a wife, they emphasize hard work far more than physical beauty. Hadza women cared deeply about a man's foraging ability and his character. And surprisingly, Hadza women mentioned physical attractiveness about as often as the men did. The old stereotype that women traded looks for resources while men hunted for beauty doesn't hold up neatly. Real life was messier, more balanced, more human. What about love? Did they feel anything like what we call romantic love? The evidence suggests yes, but in a context that's almost unrecognizable to us. The oldest known representation of a couple making love is a stone figurine from a cave near Bethlehem, carved roughly 11,000 years ago. It shows two people face to face, one person's arms wrapped around the other in an intimate embrace. It's not a fertility symbol. It's not a god. It's just two humans holding each other, captured in stone by someone who understood exactly what that meant. Evolutionary biologists now believe that romantic love may have evolved as a kind of commitment device, a way of focusing intense emotional energy on one partner, overriding short-term temptations, and securing the long-term cooperation needed to raise children who take more than a decade to become self-sufficient. In more than 95% of mammal species, males provide no direct care to offspring. Humans are the dramatic exception. But the stone figurine tells us something else. The hands that carved it belonged to a person living at the very end of the Paleolithic. By that time, humans had already been forming pair bonds for hundreds of thousands of years. And one of the most remarkable pieces of evidence for this comes from a site in Russia called Sunghir. 34,000 years ago, a small group of people buried 4 of their dead there with extraordinary care. 2 children were laid in a grave with more than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, hundreds of fox teeth, and an adult femur packed with red ochre. When geneticists sequenced their genomes in 2017, they found something that stunned them. Despite living in tiny groups of perhaps 25 people, groups where you might expect everyone to be closely related, these 4 individuals were genetically no closer than second cousins. They were not inbreeding. The genes showed that their community had deliberately, systematically, for generations, chosen mates from outside their immediate band. Eski Willerslev, who led the study, put it bluntly. What this means is that even people in the Upper Paleolithic, who were living in tiny groups, understood the importance of avoiding inbreeding. They must have developed a system for this purpose. Marta Mirazon-Lar, his colleague at Cambridge, added, at some point, early human societies changed their mating system into one in which a large number of the individuals that form small hunter-gatherer units are non-kin. They embedded themselves in a wide social network. They developed rituals, ceremonies, perhaps even proto-weddings. The exchange of mates between groups, marked by jewelry, ochre, and elaborate burial rites. This is the world that produced us. Not a world of isolated nuclear families. Not a world of endless strangers, but a world of small bands linked by kinship and ritual. A world where a grandmother in her 60s gathered more food than a mother in her 20s, provisioning her grandchildren and freeing their parents to hunt and forage. A world where children were raised not by 2 overwhelmed adults, but by a dozen hands, grandmothers, aunts, older cousins, all within sight of the same fire. A world where a man who hoarded meat or a woman who broke a promise was talked about, joked about, shamed, and if they didn't change, eventually had no camp that would take them. Gossip was the legal system. Reputation was everything. And love was not separate from survival. It was the mechanism that made survival possible. Now, think about what we've traded. You can swipe through more faces in an evening than your ancestors met in a lifetime. Apps present you with an infinite scroll of potential partners, each reduced to a few photos and a sentence. Your brain, which evolved to evaluate character over months of shared firelight, is now asked to make a decision in half a second. A study from Fudan University recently found that young people in modern China encounter roughly 60 times more opposite-sex individuals than their parents' generation. And yet, deep emotional connection rates have dropped by over 80%. We have more options than any humans in history, and we are lonelier than ever. This is not a call to go back. Nobody is suggesting we abandon medicine, or indoor plumbing, or the right to choose a partner freely. But we made trades, real ones, and we rarely talk about what we lost. We lost the campfire. We lost the grandmothers teaching children while parents foraged. We lost the slow, deep knowledge of another person that comes from lifetimes of shared experience. We gain choice, privacy, autonomy, and we paid for it with loneliness, anxiety, and an endless scroll. But the old wiring is still there. The same oxytocin that bonded your ancestors around a fire still floods your brain when you hold someone you love. The same instinct that made a Hadza woman value a man who shared his kill fairly still makes you trust someone who shows up for you over time. The same need to be known, to be chosen, to belong to a small group of people who would notice if you disappeared. It's still running, quiet and ancient, beneath everything you do. You're still a hunter-gatherer, choosing a mate in the dark. You just stopped having the fire.